Spoilers ahead.
The Poughkeepsie Tapes is a found-footage horror film directed by John Dowdle, who you may know from As Above, So Below and 2008's Quarantine, which is the English-speaking remake of the Spanish found-footage horror hit Wreck, whose star, as a side note, Manuela Velasco, probably loves me. Or at least she would if she'd read any of my frickin' letters.
They finished making the Poughkeepsie Tapes in 2007, but it took a few years after that for it to receive any kind of wider recognition. One reason for that was MGM, the production company, who was undergoing a number of structural changes in 2007, and the timing of those structural changes resulted in a number of unnecessary delays. And when it was released in a limited capacity, it was pulled pretty quickly from theaters as a result of poor box office numbers. And finally, most relevant to we horror fans, the movie was considered too graphic and disturbing for mainstream audiences, so at the end of the day, it ended up sitting on a shelf collecting dust for a really long time. Let's take a look at why this intense and disturbing movie has earned itself such a cult following in spite of all of its early distribution challenges. I'm going to recap the movie for you briefly, but try and think of it less like a plot and more like a series of events retold in chronological order. And finally, you might notice I have to get creative with a few words here and there to avoid having the video taken down.
The plot.
The movie opens with the police raiding a house in Poughkeepsie, New York, and they find about 800 VHS tapes left behind by a serial killer. The tapes show him torturing and killing his victims in a variety of brutal and disturbing ways. He's meticulous in his planning and his execution, and it's obvious he takes pleasure in the pain and suffering of his victims. Despite the enormous quantity of footage, the killer's always disguised, so the police launch an investigation in hopes of catching him. The movie constantly switches back and forth between the found footage and the interviews they did with the experts who worked on the case. The first video we're shown features his first victim, an 8-year-old girl he abducts in broad daylight from her own front lawn. Then he grapes and myrtles her. After the success of his first crime, he gets more brazen by convincing a couple to give him a ride. He clubs the driver and chloroforms the wife, and then he does a C-section on the still-living woman and sews the head of her husband into her stomach. Then he wakes her up to film her reaction. And after that, he uses sign language and a CCTV camera at a gas station to tell the police where he left the bodies. The killer's next victim's a young girl named Cheryl Dempsey. He finishes off her boyfriend and takes Cheryl back to a basement he's converted into a torture chamber of sorts. He violates Cheryl in every possible way and keeps her alive as a slave. Cheryl's mom does a televised statement in hopes of appealing to the kidnapper's sense of decency, but instead he goes to visit the mother and makes it obvious he's the one who took her before he runs off laughing. When his crimes inevitably start gaining notoriety, he completely changes his approach and pretends he's a police officer so he can target ladies of the night. And at this point, the media start calling him the Water Street Butcher. The sudden change in behavior leads the investigators to a police officer named James Foley. He has no alibi and his DNA is found all over the victims, so he ends up getting convicted and sentenced to death in 1996. He refuses to take any plea deals and insists he's innocent the entire time, right up until his death by lethal injection in 2001. And a few days after his death, the real killer leaves a map in his mailbox showing the location of another body. It turns out Foley was framed with DNA he donated to a fertility clinic. He's exonerated posthumously for the murders, but no one really notices because the news is dominated by the events of September 11th. And after yet another killing, the investigators used the map to find the empty house all the tapes were found in. They also find Cheryl Dempsey in the house, alive in a box. They rescue her, but the physical and psychological damage inflicted proves to be irreversible. She ends up constantly harming herself in secret, and in an interview, she defends the serial killer and insists he loves her and that he'll be coming back for her. She brings her own life to an end 2 weeks later, and then somebody pulls her body from the grave and drags it behind a car, leaving a VHS recording of the event in her empty coffin.
And there you have it, folks. Now, worry not, I have left loads out of that recap because that's about as much as I can bring you here on YouTube. Let's take a look at the good bits.
The good bits.
There's been obvious comparisons drawn between the Poughkeepsie Tapes and other found footage movies like the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity. And like those movies, I think Poughkeepsie Tapes works because the low budget means the director won't have extensive special effects at his disposal or established Hollywood names to get people into theater seats. And that forces a director to create the tension and atmosphere with things that are actually scary. Despite the highly controversial subject matter, the Poughkeepsie Tapes is a well-crafted and effective horror movie. It uses a variety of techniques to create a sense of dread and fear, and its particular found footage style makes it feel immediate and real. If you're considering using the found footage format for your own film, this is a really great example of how to do it properly. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Poughkeepsie Tapes is the way in which it blurs the line between reality and fiction. The movie's presented as a documentary, and the low-key approach to the production and the casting and even the commentary on the footage itself makes the movie feel more like a true crime documentary than a horror movie. And that's a ballsy move because it means the horror has to come directly from the events themselves. And as horror fans, we all know how easily heavy-handed descriptions and excessive telling can ruin an otherwise promising premise. And as for the events themselves, there's an undeniable realism to the killer's acts. Along with the on-screen physical manhandling of his victims, he also forces some of them to participate in a series of twisted games, including one called Simon Says, where he forces them to cut parts of themselves off. While these things are going on, he's often speaking to the victims in a calm and soothing voice. And as heinous as all of these events are, every single one of them could be happening right this second in your own neighbor's basement. The movie also plays with a number of horror tropes to create a proper sense of dread, and one of the more powerful ones is the killer is never shown in full. That adds an element of mystery, which in turn adds a great deal of depth to the story. He's not even shown briefly at the end of the movie, and that in itself takes a great deal of restraint for a horror director. Even the soundtrack's used to great effect to create a sense of unease in this movie, and that's not common with this format. The movie ends with the killer's ultimate fate unknown. The investigators are still reviewing the tapes, and the killer's still at large. The movie leaves the viewer with a sense of unease and uncertainty, wondering if the killer will ever be caught and brought to justice. And that's also a ballsy move, but it's one that really works here because it plants an evil little seed in the viewer's heads. Who knows? Maybe this guy lives on your street now. Maybe you know him. And if you do, what if he decides to set his sights on you next?
The Shite Bits.
One of this movie's criticisms is that it is overly graphic and disturbing. The movie does not shy away from showing the killer's crimes in all of their gory, up-close detail. There are scenes of verbal and physical abuse in the basement that convey such realism they're far harder to watch than any typical slasher movie or supernatural ghost story. As much as I can't stand the word anymore, as I believe its true meaning's been hijacked, there are a number of scenes in this movie that I would call legitimately triggering, and it's arguable they've been designed that way intentionally. But while this does make the movie a very difficult watch for some people, I'd argue the movie's realism is exactly what makes it stand out. And without it, it would never have achieved the sense of horror and revulsion that it's now known for. And this ties in directly with another criticism of the movie in that it's exploitative and sensationalistic. Some viewers have accused the Poughkeepsie Tapes of glorifying violence and intimate assault, and of using the killer's crimes solely for shock value. While the criticism's valid, I'd counter it with 2 points. Firstly, you can also argue movies like this provide commentary on the American media's obsession with violence and crime, much the way Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers did in 1995 when it presented Mickey and Mallory Knox as cultural icons. And if you can see it through that lens, shock value becomes a requisite ingredient. It is the whole point. And secondly, and this point goes well beyond the boundaries of scary movies, if you find this particular subgenre of a genre known for frightening and shocking and terrifying its willing viewers to be too much for your sensibilities, walk past the door to that theater and go see something more suited to you.
The Verdict.
So, should you watch the Poughkeepsie Tapes? Or should you make a 6-inch wide incision into your abdomen and tuck the DVD in there for another time?
Plain and simple, this movie is not for everyone. But if you consider yourself a real fan of horror and a real fan of true crime, in my humble opinion, as a fan of both, I would highly recommend you check out this movie, and I would highly recommend you go into it knowing it has a different level of intensity. If you are finding the movie too intense, you're going to figure that out pretty early on, and at that point, you'll have two options available to you. Push yourself a bit further. Try and broaden your horror horizons a little bit. Turn the movie off. Until next time, folks.
It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!